السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. حي على الصلاة. حي على الصلاة. حي على الفلاح. حي على الفلاح. الله أكبر الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله.
إن الحمد لله تعالى نحمده ونستعين به ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله تعالى من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا. من يهده الله تعالى فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له، وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، وأشهد أن محمدًا عبده ورسوله. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون. يا أيها الناس اتقوا ربكم الذي خلقكم من نفس واحدة وخلق منها زوجها وبث منهما رجالا كثيرا ونساء، واتقوا الله الذي تساءلون به والأرحام إن الله كان عليكم رقيبا. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله وقولوا قولا سديدا يصلح لكم أعمالكم ويغفر لكم ذنوبكم، ومن يطع الله ورسوله فقد فاز فوزا عظيما. أما بعد، فإن أصدق الحديث كلام الله، خير الهدي هدي محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم، وشر الأمور محدثاتها، وكل محدثة بدعة، وكل بدعة ضلالة، وكل ضلالة فهي في النار. ثم أما بعد. All praise is due to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We praise Him and we thank Him. We seek refuge in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from the evils of our souls and from our sinful deeds. Whomever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guides, no one else can misguide. And whomever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala leads astray, no one else can guide. And I bear witness that there is no deity worthy of worship except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I bear witness that Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam is his last messenger. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala send his blessings on Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, on his noble family, his honorable companions, and all of those who follow his path. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us among them. Allahumma ameen. We're still continuing our journey with Surat al-Khahf. The last time we started to talk about the few ayahs that summarized the story of the people of the cave, which is one of the stories that are mentioned in Surat al-Khahf. And the last time we left the youth taking refuge in the cave, and we left them making dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. إذ أوى الفتية إلى الكهف فقالوا ربنا آتنا من لدنك رحمة وهيئ لنا من أمرنا رشدا. As the youth has fled and took refuge in the cave, and they made dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give them two things: to give them mercy and to give them guidance. Today, inshallah Rabbil Alameen, we're going to talk about the next few ayahs. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, after this ayah, He has said, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم فضربنا على آذانهم في الكهف سنين عددا ثم بعثناهم لنعلم أي الحزبين أحصى لما لبثوا أمدا. Therefore, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has covered their senses of hearing, causing them to go into deep sleep in the cave for several years. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala raised them from their sleep so that He might test which of the two parties were more accurate in estimating the time period that they had spent in their sleep. So basically, the previous ayah ended with a dua. The people of the cave making dua, asking for two things: mercy and guidance. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala responded to their dua in these two ayahs. And subhanAllah, Allah's answer to their dua, first of all, the ayah starts with a fa, فَضَرَبْنَا عَلَى آذَانِهِمْ. And the fa in the Arabic is used for ta'qib wa surah, something happening quickly. And we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will always answer our prayers, and we will get to this in a second. But Allah's answer to their dua was to put them into deep sleep. And the scholars wanted to understand, why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put them to deep sleep? And how is that a response to their dua? Now, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put them to deep sleep because they were fleeing from the persecutors in fear that they might capture them, they might torture them, they might kill them, they might force them to leave their iman. So their hearts were full of fear. And when you are in fear, when you are very worried, it's very difficult to fall asleep. So one of the first bounties that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given them is to allow them to fall into sleep, so that their hearts stop trembling, so that their hearts, which are now full of fear and worry, can go into tranquility and rest. Because now that these believers will not be able to find them, and now they are having this tranquility and they can fall into sleep. And this bounty that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given to the people of the cave has been given to the mu'min several times, and it's mentioned in the Quran. In Ghazwat Badr, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِذْ يُغَشِّيكُمُ النُّعَاسَ أَمَنَةً مِّنْهُ. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has covered the mu'min just before the battle of Badr. They were outnumbered, they were outpowered, and they were in so much fear. But one of Allah's bounties to put their fears to rest is to allow them to slumber, to go to slumber and sleep. Also happened in Ghazwat Uhud. So sometimes when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala just want to be more alert to the bounties that we are surrounded by, but we are heedless of. Sometimes when you are in so much worry and distress, the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows you to sleep, gives you this kind of tranquility, is in itself a bounty that's worth thanking Allah for. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically put kind of a veil on their ears and allowed them to sleep. And we don't need to get into the details, but we all know humans have multiple senses. When you are sleeping, you cannot see, you cannot smell, but most people, when they wake up because they heard something. If it's loud enough, you will wake up. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in this ayah specifically that He had put a veil blocking their sense of hearing so that they can't fall asleep. And now the next part that I want to talk about is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala responded to their dua. Now, imagine the story. A group of mu'min, scholars say they were 7, fleeing from a tyrant, fleeing from the entire tribe or entire village, trying to persecute them, and they take refuge in a cave and they make dua. If you and I were thinking about this, saying, okay, if Allah accepts their dua, how can Allah give them victory? How can Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make them emerge victorious. We can think like maybe Allah will send lightning upon those people, maybe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will send wind, maybe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will send an awful cry like He has done with some of the other groups of disbelievers. But no, Allah's response to their dua was to put them to sleep. And this teaches us something. We, as slaves and servants of Allah, we do not get to choose how Allah responds to our dua. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala responds in His ultimate wisdom and knowledge and gives us what's best for us. Now, part of the etiquette of the dua is to have a firm belief that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hears and listens what you're asking for. And He will give you definitely something. But what He gives you is up to Him, not up to you. Some people try to be the senders and the receivers. I'm asking for this job, I want to get this job. I'm asking to get married, I want to get married next week. I'm asking to get this car, I want to get this car, especially for the worldly things. No, it's not up to us. We're only commanded to make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it's part of your ibadah. Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, in the authentic hadith, he said, "Ad-du'a huwa al-ibadah." Making invocation to Allah, praying to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is one of the major aspects of worship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You're commanded to do that. But how Allah responds, what Allah gives you is up to Him, not up to us. Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said in the authentic hadith, narrated by Imam Ahmed fi musnadihi, and has been deemed sahih by Imam al-Albani. He said that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, ما من مسلم يدعو بدعوة ليس فيها إثم ولا قطيعة رحم إلا أعطاه الله بها إحدى ثلاث إما أن تعجل دعوته وإما أن يدخرها له في الآخرة وإما أن يصرف عنه من السوء مثلها. قالوا الصحابة قالوا إذا نكثر. قال الله أكثر. صدق رسول الله. So Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said that any Muslim, any mu'min, making dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, asking for something, as long as he's not asking for Allah to help him do a sin, doing a sinful deed, or as long as he's not asking for something that will lead to cutting the ties of kinship. If you avoid those two things and you're asking Allah for something, you will get a response. But the response is up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The response could be one of three things. Either that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives you what you're asking for. You're asking for good health, Allah will give you good health. If you're asking for this job, Allah will give you this job. That could be one thing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives it to you. Or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not give it to you, but He will keep this da'wah for you, and you will be rewarded for it on the day of judgment. Remember, just the fact that you're making dua is an action of worship. And the third thing is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will be protecting you from something harmful, equivalent to the good thing that you asked for. Like you asked for a car or a job or a wife or whatever it is, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could basically protect you from something harmful, a disease or an accident or whatnot that you're destined to have, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will basically protect you from that. So you are getting something for sure. That's our aqeedah. That's our belief. So when the Sahaba heard that, what did they say? They said, إِذَا نُكْثِرْ. Then we should make plenty of dua. Then we should be asking Allah for many things. So Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam gave us the glad tidings. He said, Allahu Akthar. Allah is more plentiful. Allah will give you more. So this hadith is calling upon us to continually make dua. For things related to the akhirah and for things related to this dunya, as long as you avoid making dua related to sins or to cutting the ties of kinship. This is why the Sahaba, the greatest generation that has ever existed in the history of Islam, when they understood that, Sayyidina Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, he said, إِنِّي لَا أَحْمِلُ هَمَّ الْإِجَابَةِ وَلَكِنِّي أَحْمِلُ هَمَّ الدُّعَاءِ. I'm not worried about my prayers or my invocation being responded to. I'm 100% sure of that. I'm only worried about my part, which is making the dua. And it's always a good sign when you find yourself able to make dua. This is a good sign that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is allowing you to make this dua, and He will give you something. But you don't get to choose. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gets to choose. يخلق ما يشاء ويختار. He creates what He wills and He chooses, subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it's also one etiquette related to the dua as we go through this ayat, is to always have thinking about Allah in the best way. It has been narrated, Hadith al-Qudsi, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala قال أنا عند ظن عبدي بي فليظن بي ما شاء. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, I am as my servant thinks of me. So let him think of me whatever he wants. What does this mean? Meaning that the more that you think that Allah will give you what you want, what you're asking for, the more that He will give it to you. A dua is an action you're doing with your tongue, but its depth is in your heart. And the strength of your dua is directly related to the depth of iman and yaqeen, certainty that you have in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala power to actually give you what you're asking for. And if He does not, then you know that you will get something else, either a protection from a harm, or what's even better is giving you a reward for this dua on the day of judgment. And remember, if you ask for something here and you get it here, it will vanish as everything else in this dunya vanishes, like we ourselves vanish. But if Allah is giving you the reward for this dua on the day of judgment, it will not vanish. It will be part that continues into the Jannah, inshallah. And that's why Imam al-Nawawi, when he was writing the book of Adhkar, it's a beautiful book. I would recommend everybody to search for it online or buy a copy. He said when he was talking about this hadith specifically, he said that this is a proof that دعاء المسلم يجاب بمطلوبه أو بغيره. It's a proof that when you make a dua, it will be accepted. Allah will respond to you, either with what you asked for or بغيره, or something else. This is how we should understand the dua. Now the next part is, from this ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, فضربنا على آذانهم في الكهف سنين عددا ثم بعثناهم لنعلم أي الحزبين أحصى لما لبثوا أمدا. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can make things work in ways we can never imagine. Unfortunately, we're living in an era where materialism has become very prevalent. It is the default in how we think. Even when it comes to this issues related to dua and ibadah and deen, we're very materialistic. When I make a dua, my proof that Allah has heard me or listened to me is I get what I asked for. And we are very limited in our view and our vision as human beings and in our knowledge. وَمَا أُوتِيتُم مِّنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. We have only been given little of knowledge, but we still think we understand everything. And we are trying to set the rules and criteria for whether my dua was accepted or not, whether victory will be given to the mu'min or not. It doesn't work this way. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when the people of the cave asked for mercy and guidance, Allah's response to them was putting them to sleep and then raising them more than 300 years after. Now think about this. In those 300 years, their dua was for guidance and mercy, right? They were given mercy. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has saved them from this tyrant ruler who was after them. And they were given guidance that they stayed on the right path till they died afterwards. And now we are reciting their story till the day of judgment, talking about how their iman was strong and they stayed on the right path. But not only that, when they woke up, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala raised them later, guidance and mercy was not limited to them. It was actually spread into their village. As the story progresses, which we'll cover in the next few khutbas, inshallah, when they were raised, their village, which at the time when they were put to sleep, they were disbelievers. But afterwards, when they woke up, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala raised them, they all became believers. Some signs of that is later on in the ayat. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that لَنَتَّخِذَنَّ عَلَيْهِمْ مَسْجِدًا. We will build a masjid upon them, which tells you they became believers. They became mu'min. And of course, it's worth noting, this is completely prohibited in Islam. Sharia can be different between different times and different prophets, but in Islam, it's prohibited to build a masjid on the graves of anybody, even if they are awliya. So the mercy and guidance that they asked for, they were granted those, and they were also, the mercy and guidance were also granted to the entire village in ways that we can never imagine. And if you go through the Quran, you will find this abundantly. Just think about Ghazwat al-Ahzab, the Confederates, how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can solve huge issues in the simplest way ever. وَمَا كَانَ اللَّهُ لِيُعْجِزَهُ مِنْ شَيْءٍ فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَلَا فِي الْأَرْضِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, nothing is beyond him. Nothing is beyond his abilities. That's what al-Ahzab and the Confederates, the enemies of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, surrounded the Medina. Different tribes, thousands of warriors, and even some of the people of the book, they also joined them. It was a huge test. And now, if you were living at that time, you would think that now the mu'min will have to fight and it will be a huge battle and huge losses, just based on the dua. How did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give them victory? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us about this in Surat Al-Ahzab. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اذكروا نعمة الله عليكم إذ جاءتكم جنود فأرسلنا عليهم ريحا وجنودا لم تروها. As simple as that. The whole battle that was expected to happen, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala solved the whole issue for the mu'min by sending some wind that took the tents off and threw fear in the Confederates, and Allah sent troops, malaika, that the mu'min didn't even see. So the whole issue was solved without even the mu'min intervening in it, except with the dua, with things that they didn't even see. They didn't see the malaika, they only seen the wind, they've heard about the wind, and the next day they found that the Confederates were just dispersed and every tribe went back to their home. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can solve any issue in ways that's beyond our imagination or understanding. We just need to have trust in Allah. وَمَا يَعْلَمُ جُنُودَ رَبِّكَ إِلَّا هُ. Nobody knows the troops of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, those that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can use for your help, except him subhanahu wa ta'ala. Another story of Sayyidina Musa. And we all know the story how the Bani Israel were prosecuted by the Pharaoh and he was killing all the newborn. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala inspired the mother of Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam. He said to her, وَأَوْحَيْنَا إِلَى أُمِّ مُوسَى أَنْ أَرْضِعِيهِ فَإِذَا خِفْتِ عَلَيْهِ فَأَلْقِيهِ فِي الْيَمِّ وَلَا تَخَافِي وَلَا تَحْزَنِي إِنَّا رَادُّوهُ إِلَيْكِ. When she had fear about him, that he will be captured, he will be killed, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala inspired her to do what? To put him into the river. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told her that do not have fear, do not have despair, we're returning him to you. Now, think about this. If you're worried about your son or a newborn baby, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is commanding you to put him into the river. Not only that, but Allah is promising you that he will return him back to you. Beyond imagination. And you can think of all the scenarios by which this can happen. But subhanAllah, a very wonderful scenario happened. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala prohibited Sayyidina Musa from any of the foster suckling mothers. And his sister was following his path, and then she told him about a family that can help rear him and take care of him. So what eventually happened is Sayyidina Musa was saved. He was returned to his mother, and they even paid for her to suckle him. The way Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala works things and take care of things are beyond our imagination. We're just limited in our understanding. We are limited in our mental capabilities, but Allah is not, subhanahu wa ta'ala. قولوا قولي هذا واستغفر الله العظيم لي ولكم فاستغفروه انه هو الغفور الرحيم. بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله ثم أما بعد. The next ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said that He has raised ثم بعثناه, Allah has raised the people of the cave لنعلم, so that His knowledge becomes evident. Which of the two parties were more accurate in estimating how long they spent sleeping? And remember when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He says لِنَعْلَمَ, like in this ayah, or many other ayahs, لَنَبْلُوَنَّكُمْ لِنَعْلَمَ حَتَّى نَعْلَمَ الْمُجَاهِدِينَ مِنكُمْ الصَّابِرِينَ. When Allah says that He would know, He's talking about the ilm al-mushahada, that His knowledge, which has no beginning or no end, becomes evident to others. It's not that Allah didn't know something and then He knew it afterwards. Hasha lillah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows everything before it happens. And He knows when it happens. So this ayah is just talking about that His knowledge becomes apparent. And it's a reminder, the word ba'athnahum basically raised them. Reminder for us when we read this every Friday, that when you go to sleep every night, this is the minor death. It's actually death. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala used the word raised, al-ba'ath, which is the same thing that will happen on the Day of Judgment. It's a reminder of the bounty that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us every single day when He raises us up when we wake up. This is why Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he used to make several du'as before he goes to sleep and several du'as when he wakes up. I only picked one here. Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, كما صح عنه, he used to say when he wakes up, الحمد لله الذي عافاني في جسدي وَرَدَّ عَلَيَّ رُوحِي وَأَذِنَ لِي بِذِكْرِهِ. All praise is due to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who gave me strength in my body, who returned my soul to me, and who has permitted me to remember Him. See that last part? Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam is basically telling us the fact that Allah allows you to wake up every single day. This is a permission for you to start making remembrance of Him. As if that your soul were given back to you on that single day so that you remember Allah. This is the ultimate goal of your entire life. So, ba'ath, reminding us of al-ba'ath, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who can raise His people who have been asleep for more than 300 years, He can definitely raise everybody else on the Day of Judgment. Aqeedah, reminding us of the ultimate power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and reminding us of the Day of Judgment, one of the main pillars of our iman. And then He says, لِنَعْلَمَ أَيُّ الْحِزْبَيْنِ أَحْصَى لِمَا لَبِثُوا أَمَلًا, so that we know which party was more accurate in estimating how long they actually spent their time sleeping. And this is telling us a truth that we have to live with. There will always be differences. People will always differ. But the ultimate truth lies with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala only. This is why the next ayah He says, نَحْنُ نَقُصُّ عَلَيْكَ نَبَأَهُمْ بِالْحَقِّ. We are indeed narrating to you this story with the absolute truth. We have very limited knowledge about what's happening around us. Even things that are happening to us our whole life. When you get a new job, or when you get married, you get a new car, you get a new house, all of the details, the inner works, things happening in the background, how you got to that stage, you have no idea about. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is taking care of it. And that alone should put tranquility in your heart, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is taking care of everything and He knows the details of everything. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِنَّ رَبَّكُمُ اللَّهُ الَّذِي خَلَقَ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضَ فِي 6 أَيَّامٍ ثُمَّ اسْتَوَى عَلَى الْعَرْشِ يُدَبِّرُ الْأَمْرِ. Indeed, it's your Lord who has created the 7 heavens and earth, and then he has risen above his throne in a way that befits his majesty, and he is arranging everything. He's taking care of everything. He's handling everything for everybody, including you and I. Again, this should be our aqidah. When we face calamities, when we face problems, remember that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has endless knowledge. And remember that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is taking care of everything. So go back to the previous ayah. Do like the people of the cave have done. Continuously pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, asking Him for mercy and guidance while having absolute confidence that He's hearing you, listening to you, and He will respond. And I will end with this two lines from Imam al-Shafi'i. He said, وَلَرُبَّ نَازِلَةٍ يَضِيقُ بِهَا الْفَتَى ذَرْعًا وَعِنْدَ اللَّهِ مِنْهَا الْمَخْرَجُ ضاقت فلما استحكمت حلقاتها فرجت وكنت أظنها لا تفرج. اللهم دبر لنا فإنا لا نحسن التدبير. اللهم فرج عنا وعن المسلمين. اللهم كن لإخواننا في فلسطين. اللهم ارحم موتاهم. اللهم تقبلهم في الشهداء والصالحين. اللهم اشف مرضاهم. اللهم داوي جرحاهم. اللهم أفرغ عليهم صبرا وتوفاهم مسلمين. اللهم اغفر لنا تقصيرنا. اللهم اغفر لنا ذنوبنا وإسرافنا في أمرنا وثبت على الحق أقدامنا وتوفنا مسلمين. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين وصل اللهم وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم وأقم الصلاة.